Welcome to Energy Vista, a podcast on energy issues, personal and professional trajectories. I'm your host, Leslie Palti-Guzman. In each episode of this podcast, we chat with energy experts from all around the world. They tell us about their passion, inspiration, and aspiration. And one of my favorite parts of this podcast is the focus on their personal trajectories. I always learn a lot and I find it very inspiring. It's June 21st, 2019, and time for a new Energy Vista episode. Today I'm exchanging with Carolyn Kissane. Carolyn is the academic director of the graduate program in global affairs at the Center for Global Affairs at NYU and is a clinical professor where she teaches graduate level courses examining the geopolitics of energy, comparative energy politics, energy, environment, and resource security. And Caroline is just back from a trip in Scandinavia, Denmark, and Norway, where she actually looked at sustainable policies in those two countries and compared their different strategies. Hi, Caroline.
Hi, Leslie. It's such a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thanks for joining us. And I'm very excited to hear your kind of takeaways from your trip. You're just back. So how was it? We often hear about the Nordic model for social democracy, but do they also have a model for decarbonization or transition to a lower carbon world?
Yes, they do. And it's especially deep decarbonization in Denmark. Denmark has a very ambitious policy to be fossil fuel free by 2050, and they are really making some very significant headway in all areas. I think one of the striking examples that my students sort of witnessed, we visited Ørsted, which is formerly known as Danish Oil and Natural Gas. And so this is a company that has very much sort of moved to being a green energy company with a lot of their assets focused on wind power, offshore wind power, and they are very much sort of divesting from most of their fossil fuels. They have a plan, I think, in the next couple of years, they'll be off of coal, and then they are, sort of dialing down on their natural gas and oil assets.
So when you compare both Denmark and Norway, they started by doing what, and how far are they in trying to reduce their utilization of fossil fuel?
Sure, great question. The big difference between Norway and Denmark is the fact that Norway remains a country that is a big producer of fossil fuels, both oil and natural gas. So, Equinor is a big contributor, and the production of oil and natural gas contributes dramatically to Norway's GDP. So, you have that side, and then you have the sort of the power sector side, which is predominantly renewable energy because they're 98% powered by hydropower. So you have, it's kind of a dual system of sorts where, oil and natural gas are very important, but in terms of sector, it's very much about hydropower. And they're also looking to develop some wind power, not to the same degree as Denmark, but it's sort of in the future planning.
And so what are the challenges in those countries to go further in their plan?
I think in terms of Denmark, it's just really a matter of time. I was impressed with the consistency in terms of the conversations that I had with people across various sectors. They really are, there seems to be this sort of collective consensus amongst the population that they will be fossil fuel free, not in the transportation sector because that's much more challenging, but in terms of their power sector, that is the intention. I think one of the challenges is the fact that, they don't yet have enough wind power, nor do they have enough biogas. They're doing waste to energy. They do have the opportunity to import hydropower actually from Norway, but, nonetheless, it is a transition, and like all energy transitions, it comes with its own set of challenges. I think for Norway, it's the fact that, domestically, they, even though their carbon emissions are great in the power sector because of their hydropower, they nonetheless recognize that they are an exporter of carbon emissions in the production and the sale of oil and natural gas. So that's kind of a contradiction that is recognized and one that they're grappling with. There's no long range plan to cease production of oil and natural gas in the North Sea, but it is something that that the country recognizes, and I think there's an ongoing debate that's happening.
Yeah, we hear a lot about the Norges Wealth Fund. We hear a lot about their positioning. They get a lot of money from oil and gas, but at the same time, they want to disinvest from their oil and gas investments. I mean, not big oil and gas company, but smaller investments, and try to be more consistent with their approach.
Yes, and I know you had Rachel Zamba on a couple of weeks ago. She actually came to my class to talk about Norway's sovereign wealth fund, and it was a great conversation. I think one of the interesting things is that this is the world's largest wealth fund, and a lot of it has come out of the sale of oil and natural gas, and they're just very, very smart investments across 3 different investment sectors, and they are divesting from pure exploration and production companies, but they remain fairly very heavily invested in integrated oil and gas companies. Whether or not we'll see kind of an unloading of that in the future, I don't anticipate it. But again, I think it is a debate that's happening in Norway, and I think it will be an ongoing one because the climate debate in the country is a fairly rich one, and the government has some very significant policies that they want to put into place. Again, there is this, recognition and acknowledgement that, oil and natural gas are very important for the economy.
Have you met with this young girl, Greta, during your trip?
I did not. She is actually Swedish, but in terms of some of the meetings that we had the opportunity in Oslo to visit Cicero, and they're really a fantastic organization doing some really cutting edge climate research. And actually, our last day in Copenhagen, we did see some kids who were protesting, and Friday is the designated day for school protests, so climate protests. And there was also a very interesting photo exhibition at the Museum of Natural History in Oslo of student demonstrations around addressing climate change.
This move to fight climate change, is it already very institutionalized in the government, or is it still very much driven by a strong environmental movement, increasingly a youth movement? What do you think is the main driver there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in terms of for Denmark, it's been institutionalized. Again, giving the example of Ørsted, being formerly Danish oil and natural gas. And the government has really established some, as I said, very ambitious policies around climate and around reducing fossil fuel consumption. Yeah. They've also built out, we saw it in Copenhagen, a really extraordinary infrastructure for cycling, for bike riding. And they really incentivize people to kind of get out of their cars. So I think there are plans to make, Copenhagen car-free in the future. And, they sort of are very committed as a society, from what I could tell and from the meetings that I had, that this is something that they are very serious about. And many of the people that I met with went back to 1973 and the oil crisis, the Arab oil embargo, as sort of that was the period of reckoning for the country, recognizing that, it is very dependent and its energy security is vulnerable. So there was kind of a decision at that point that they wanted to think about domestic energy security, and that really sort of started the movement around building out an offshore wind power sector. And I think Denmark globally right now is a leader in offshore wind.
And do you think those kind of transitions are easier to make when you're a less populous country than others?
Well, I had to remind my students, because there is that, it's, you're going into these meetings and you're hearing these just, really extraordinary narratives about how they're making this dramatic energy transition. And it seems to be, tremendous collective cultural buy-in, and recognizing here in the United States that it's a more contentious sort of debate and process. But again, Norway is little under 5.5 million people, and Denmark is a little over 5.5 million people. Mm-hmm. So it's it is easier to do it, and I think that it's more culturally ingrained in terms of environmentalism, right, and a commitment to sort of being more energy independent in the sense of using more renewable energy that they can produce domestically.
Yeah. You mentioned quickly biogas. Do they see a role for natural gas in the medium term, long term?
Yeah, well, definitely in terms of, in Denmark, it's still, natural gas is still part of their energy mix. Mm-hmm. They do plan as they look towards 2050, and for some cities actually even earlier, that plan to be fossil fuel free, that they will be winding down even their use of natural gas. But when we look then at Norway, which gas is an important export for the country, that it's gas is still going to remain very, very important.
Okay. And so when we talk about energy transition, electrification is going to be a big part. Was it something you saw a lot during your trip? And what are the sources of financing for greater electrification and connectivity between maybe potentially different countries in Europe?
Yeah, no, that's another fantastic question. In terms of, again, as you know, right, we're just seeing that. That's, when you look at where investments are, a lot of them are happening in the sort of electrification space, and this sort of recognition that, sort of part of this larger, deeper energy transition is going to mean that the world is going to be more electrified. So for just using sort of Norway as the example, they do have the benefit of having, 98% of their mix comes from hydropower. So, when you talk about the EV sector, the electric vehicle sector, which in 2018, over 50% of the cars that were purchased in Norway were electric vehicles. Part of that is coming out of some, incentives. In terms of larger Europe, I think there's a lot happening. There's a lot happening on the interconnectivity front. Mm-hmm. So as countries sort of seek to increase their sort of individual sort of electricity mixes, that they're also looking to see, where they can get energy from other sources. So, for example, one of the conversations that we heard a lot about was as Norway builds out some wind, or even with their own hydropower, excess hydropower, that's something that they can export. Mm-hmm. Again, a great contributor to the countries that are part of Nord Pool, that they can buy hydropower, which is a clean source, yeah, of energy, and it's part of Europe's larger project to increase the amount of renewables. But paying for it is I think it's a challenge overall. An interesting conversation that I had at Thema Consulting was the issue of Germany and transmission lines. And I think that's, a conversation we hear here in the United States, as well as some of the, difficulties of building out transmission lines and pipelines, for example. And, as Germany seeks to sort of make its energy transition, they want to shut down nuclear, which date is now, it's 2022 that they will shut down the remainder of their nuclear power. They also, are looking to sort of build out more wind and solar, but they need more transmission lines, and that's proving to be politically very contentious.
So that's very interesting, because we hear a lot about pipeline opposition, environmental opposition, because It's the link that you have between keeping the reserve underground potentially and bringing it to markets. But for transmission, it's less, I think, heard of. So, what kind of political opposition or environmental opposition is that?
Yeah, so, and this is actually goes back. I was actually in Germany in 2015 with students looking at Germany's energy transition. And in 2015, it was, a big point of conversation, and in the context of the Energiewende, right? So you have lots of offshore wind in the north, and you have a lot of industrial production in the south. So, it's kind of important to be able to sort of move some of that energy down to the south where there's higher demand, but there's really some contention over building that transmission line from the north to the south. And part of that, as we were told, is kind of NIMBYism. You've got a very densely populated area, and people don't want overhead transmission, but the cost of building underground transmission is also very, very expensive. So, they're looking at maybe 2028, maybe a little bit earlier, but this is not something that's going to be sort of in the very near future, which, again, is interesting for a country that, has made such strong commitments to moving off of coal and moving off of nuclear, that they are nonetheless really challenged by building out some of the transmission lines that they need to have a more sort of cohesive energy system within the country. And I think we heard that as well in the context of Norway, that there are two transmission lines that connect Norway with Europe, and the idea of building out more is there's some political backlash against it. So whether or not you'll see that kind of new transmission build that's important for sort of that interconnectivity issue for Europe is, I think, something interesting to watch.
Yeah, for sure. I know that the European Union is shifting a lot of its Connecting Europe Facility Fund towards electricity versus natural gas in the years to come. But that's not a huge, it's not a huge amount of funding, but still it can help for some EU members.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, kind of going back to your earlier question about funding, that was kind of a question in Norway in terms of sort of who funds the transmission lines, right? Is it the government? We were told that there would be more sort of public acceptance if it was the government, and less so if you had sort of private players building those transmission lines. And that's really interesting, just in terms of sort of recognizing that that's going to be a issue, not just in terms of some of the debate and contention around building out new transmission, but also the funders and where the funding comes from.
And did you feel that the private players were proactively endorsing the transition and making moves to green themselves, or was it a forced move?
So it's such a great... one of the things that my students were both impressed and they were so surprised is almost every meeting that we had. And, we met with Ramboll in Copenhagen, and we met with, as I mentioned, Ørsted, and, a number of other companies, and then, Equinor in Norway. And, across the board, we heard so many references to the Sustainable Development Goals, that there seems to be kind of a very deep thread in terms of corporate culture and operations, that this is something really important, not just as something important for their marketing, but is really that they have built into how they think about their operations and how they think about sort of sustainability, and how they can really show evidence that they are in fact sort of greening their corporations with regards to how they use energy, how they're addressing climate change, what the supply chain looks like, So that, I think, is something that I felt very much there's been the buy-in. I don't think you need to sort of push companies that are working, at least again, from my experience in Denmark and Norway, that companies seem to be very much on board. And I think that they recognize that this is, a movement that they'd rather be ahead of rather than behind.
Right. That's great to hear. And I guess they know that if they want to last in the longer term, that's the strategy to go.
Yeah, and that's something that we were told, that companies that are not, and there's you also have these are countries that have used effectively taxation. So there is that corporations also see that for their own bottom line, it's really important that they meet new standards and that they even go deeper, because the cost of not doing so is it's a very high one for the companies. So in Norway you have a carbon tax, and you have some as I said, some strict penalties for companies that are not sort of doing what they need to do. And I think in terms of Denmark, you have a real, there's just tremendous buy-in and commitment. And again, they recognize that they can actually make money by being more sustainable and reducing energy costs, and sort of diminishing some of that volatility that comes with relying on outside sources for energy.
Great. So Caroline, let's move to our personal and professional trajectory. So you're teaching graduate students, and you just brought them in during your trip, some of them. What do you like the most about teaching, and how did you manage to combine teaching and energy issues?
It's great. Thank you. So I love teaching. I think I really discovered it in 2003. I took a visiting position up at Colgate University, and I was teaching undergraduate students, and I just realized how happy I was in the classroom, and it just felt very much like home. And it was then that I said, I really do want to make this my career. So I've been kind of teaching full time ever since. It's been a couple, more than a decade, Leslie. And so I just love it. And, energy, it was so interesting. So I really came into energy as a graduate student. I did my PhD at Columbia, and I had the opportunity I received an area language studies fellowship, and I was in Kazakhstan and Russia. And this was in the mid 90s. And, it was impossible not to sort of see the really extraordinary influence that natural resources had and have in both countries. So I kind of decided that I really wanted to sort of weave that into my graduate studies. And I started to look at the role of natural resources in transitions, because, at this time, Kazakhstan was, a relatively newly independent country, and, oil was playing a very big role in its development. So that was kind of my initial sort of breakout moment for getting involved in the energy space and sort of thinking about it from a research perspective.
Yeah. And what kind of guiding principles or main lessons you want your students to leave the class with?
Well, one, I really want them to be excited about the energy space. There are so many, amazing things happening. I'm always sort of, every semester as I kind of go into the class, I tell students that, I can't imagine a more incredible space to work in terms of the pace of innovation. And also, it's something I remind students about, about how integral energy is in our lives and how important it is for development. And, when we talk about, international development, which is, one of the concentrations we have here at the Center for Global Affairs, is that, if access to energy is pivotal. It's critical for societies and, students to be part of that, wanting to be involved and engage themselves in that sort of both from a development perspective, but also sort of to be part of, what is now, a very large global energy transition that we're making. And I'll just sort of say, I'm also really fortunate to have some fantastic alumni who are now sort of working in many different parts of the world who are in the energy space. I have a number of students who are down in Houston and students who are, consultants on LNG and who are working in utilities. And just when they come back and they talk to my students about, how exciting and how many opportunities there are and that they've experienced in their careers, I think that's a great way to tell the story.
Yeah, for sure. And over the years, do you find that there is increasingly more interest from students to understand those complex energy issues? And what about the ratio women versus men in your class?
Yeah, no, that's been a really striking difference. When I started teaching at NYU, it was 2005. I taught my first geopolitics and oil class in 2006, and it was more than 3/4 male. And, my most recent geopolitics of energy class this past spring was more than 50% female. So, and we also, a course that we offer that's hugely popular is global electricity markets. And there's been, again, a sort of a seismic shift in the number of women that I've seen who are pursuing, looking at working in the power sector, who are thinking about, opportunities in utilities. So I think that's probably you and I both, right? We see when we go to conferences and, we're seeing more women. We need a lot more women. I think we definitely need more women across the sort of energy landscape. So I feel like that's an important role that I have, since I am in the classroom, and then I do advise students to sort of help them sort of see the opportunities and the really exciting trajectories that are before them.
Absolutely. So I have to ask you about your hair, because you have beautiful curly red hair, and as women, we know that the way we look in the workplace matters more than if we were men. And that, the way we present ourselves, convey, it's important. And, in corporate America, usually the standard is straight hair and blow dry. But there is kind of a movement right now. I like my hair. And so I was wondering, was it for you a trajectory to kind of accept your hair, or from the beginning? I mean, you're definitely standing out in a crowd, which is, I think, great, because when you're a woman and there are so few women in the energy place, I don't think we should look like men in a black suit and blend, but I really admire you for that.
Well, I appreciate the question. It's so I could give you the very, very honest, straightforward answer, which is I guess in terms of when I think about how I spend my time in the morning, like the last thing I'd want to do is pick up a blow dryer or to spend an hour at a blow dry, like one of those dry bars or something like that. So part of it is just, how I prioritize my time and, spending time sort of forcing my hair to do something that I won't naturally do is, and I think it's interesting. I've had some friends who have curly hair and who do straighten their hair, and some of them feel that they are sort of more professionally accepted, and that they have observed change, they recognize that they're sometimes treated differently, whether or not they have straight hair or they have curly hair. I haven't entertained the experiment so much personally, but I think what you said earlier is identity, and I think right now, if I started to straighten my hair, people would be like, what happened? Where are all those curls? Like, who are you? I don't, so I think now it's just like, this is, this is just who I am.
Yeah.
So as you said, like, people usually can find me in a crowd.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I guess I'll, hopefully it's to my advantage.
I think it definitely is, yes. But yeah, I think it's sad. And I think you're right. Some women think that they look more professional if they have this kind of standard blow dry. And that it helps them with advancement, which shouldn't, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and again, like I guess, as someone who works with young women, I also want them to sort of see that I'm not I'm not sort of contriving who I
Right.
am to sort of fit,
Yeah.
that I want them to really embrace who they are and, bring that difference, into the energy and environment space, because I think it's something that we need. And, it shouldn't be, we shouldn't be sort of creating or contributing to sort of this cookie cutter, approach to what it means to be a professional in this space.
Totally. I second that second you in that. And on this note, which I think is very optimistic, thank you so much for participating, Caroline, and we'll hear from you soon again.
And yeah, can I just do a quick shout out? I just want to thank you so much for doing this and for starting your podcast. I think it's so fantastic, and it's just wonderful to sort of hear from different people. And, I love the fact that you sort of also bring in sort of the personal. I think it's very special. So thank you
very much.
Take care.
Bye. That concludes our Energy Vista podcast, which was recorded on June 21st, 2019. Our theme music is provided by Music Screen licensed under Creative Commons. This is Leslie Palti-Guzman. Say good day and good luck.